Are they real? Are they not? One of my favorite books is called The 13th Warrior. You may have seen the movie with
Antonio
Banderas, who plays an Arab who goes off with the Vikings. This story was actually written as sort of a challenge. The various great stories, especially that of Beowulf, the epic of Beowulf, which you probably all read about in high school. They wondered, was that based off of somebody real? And they sort of had a challenge amongst these great writers to see if they could do something like that. So he took the tale sort of, not necessarily in reverse, but made a mirror image of it and tried to base everything off of fact, that there were scrolls found in the desert of this man who had gone off to go with the Vikings and what really happened. It was really quite an interesting twist. That, of course, is all made up. But to this day, there are still people who find traces of what may have been the real King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So the question is, where do we leave fantasy and enter into history? And that's really where folklore and folk tales come in. So in Haunted Tampa Bay, I wanted to think about Tampa. And one place that some of you may know about, that you may not know, or you may have been there and didn't even realize it, is the Fort Brooke area. For about 100 years, the Seminoles lived peacefully in Florida, but by the early 19th century, the white man had set his sights on their sunny peninsula. Florida became a territory of the United States in 1822. The ink was barely dry on the treaty with Spain when the United States decided to establish a military presence near the mouth of the Hillsborough River. On January 10, 1824, Colonel George Mercer Brooke and 4 companies of the 4th U.S. Infantry arrived at the selected site. A wooden fort was constructed from local materials. Originally called Cantonment Brook, it became Fort Brooke later that same year. Among the soldiers stationed at Fort Brooke was a young officer and graduate of West Point named George A. McCall. While serving in Florida, he wrote many letters home to his family. These letters were preserved and later gathered and published under the title Letters from the Frontier. In a letter to his father dated March 28, 1824, George recounts what may be Tampa's earliest recorded ghost story.
Okay.
At about 9:30 on a foggy morning, one of the sentinels who had climbed to the top of a huge live oak for a sweeping view of all of Tampa Bay suddenly called out, "Sail ho!" Officers and men, some carrying telescopes, hurried to the shore and saw sails on the horizon. Was it 4 ships? Was it 5? It was hard to tell at a distance. But as the ships continued to come nearer and nearer, they could clearly discern the sails of 5 ships. Uncertain as to just who might be in these ships, Colonel Brooke decided to go out and meet them and ordered refreshments to be prepared to welcome their guests, whoever they may be. But as the commander and several other soldiers were getting into a small boat to row out to meet the ships, one of the soldiers cried out, "Where are the vessels?" The 5 ships had completely disappeared. According to McCall, men rubbed their eyes and could not believe them. There was never an explanation for the phantom ships that vanished from Tampa Bay that spring. But there were many at the time who remembered that a ship's crew had recently been murdered by pirates in that very spot. Were these ships sailed by the ghosts of that murdered crew? No answer has ever been found. As we know from a lot of our festivals, such as Gasparilla, which is named after Jose Gaspar, and Gasparilla literally means Little Gaspar. He was a short guy. No offense to him, because he'd probably kill you for saying that. But there were a lot of piracy going on during that time. There was a lot of good money for them to make. Fort Brooke remained an important outpost for many years. Throughout the Seminole Wars, it served as a launching point for troops and as a supply depot. During the Civil War, it was captured by Union forces on May 6, 1864. But as the war ended and the years passed, the government decided that the old fort had outlived its usefulness. The fort was decommissioned by the U.S. Army in 1883, so it had been in use for 60 years. The buildings were simply abandoned and allowed to deteriorate. In time, the area where the fort once stood became the Sin District of Tampa. In the waning days of the 19th century, other structures were built over the old foundations. Fort Brooke had just become a part of history. However, in 1980, the city began construction of a municipal parking garage. It was to be a large structure near the intersections of Franklin and Whiting. Unfortunately, when they began to dig the foundations, they made a grisly discovery. It seems that when Fort Brooke was abandoned in 1883, nearly 100 years prior, no one had bothered to do anything with the Fort Brooke cemetery. Bear in mind that the bodies in that graveyard were not embalmed. Many did not have coffins, and the few that did had coffins made of wood. Not every grave had a marker, and the few that did were marked with wood, not in stone. In most cases, over a century had passed since the original interment. Decay and composition had taken their toll. What was left was little more than bones. Still, there were some clues to the identity of the remains. Metal buttons, scraps of wool clinging to skeletons suggest that some of the dead were soldiers who wore heavily wool uniforms even in the Florida heat. Wooden buttons and cotton cloth suggested settlers. A few scattered beads even suggested the bodies of Seminoles were buried there. Further excavations even revealed a few bones that were dated back almost 2,000 years, undoubtedly the remains of the Tocobaga who once lived on this spot. Of course, this was a cause of some concern among historians and archaeologists, but progress will not be stopped. The bones were removed and construction continued. The bones that were deemed to be from settlers and soldiers were moved to a mass burial in Oaklawn Cemetery on the outskirts of downtown. The bones of the Seminoles were given to the Florida Seminole tribe and were buried on tribal land, actually out near the Seminole Hard Rock Casino. There was no living tribe to claim the Tocobaga bones, as that tribe is now considered extinct. So they too were buried in a separate mass grave at Oaklawn. It is worth noting that with all the intervening years, there is no way to be certain that all of the remains were removed from the site before construction continued. Perhaps that accounts for the strange occurrences in the Fort Brooke parking garage. People say they've seen shadows cast upon the walls when there was no living being present to cast such a shadow. The sounds of chanting and Native American drums have been heard. You know, a strange feeling often overcomes people who walk into stairwells, especially in parking garages. One young lady who works in one of the nearby banks parks there every day, noting, when you park in most parking garages, you feel creeped out because you're alone. In the Fort Brooke parking garage, you feel creeped out because you know you're not alone. Now, let me assuage your fears. Of course, there are no proof of ghosts, no proof of any sort of things going on. It's all personal experience. And this is just part of Tampa Bay's history. So I encourage all of you to explore and find out where folklore becomes history, or where maybe folklore becomes truth. Thank you.